Hello, this is Francesca Recchia, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today. The conversation we are hosting today at the Police Project is part of our wider effort with Watch the State to document and understand what's going on in India with the second wave of COVID-19. The topic of today's discussion is something really urgent and very necessary. We'll discuss the situation of the vaccine in India and the drive and its challenges. There's a lot of talking, a lot of discussion, but very little understanding. So our hope is that with the conversation today, we'll make will help create some clarity and clear some of the questions that people may have. As usual, please do follow us on all our platforms and do send questions on our online channels. Srinivas, I leave it to you, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Francesca. So, welcome everyone. Today we have two important guests with us. It's Mr. Murali Neelakantan and Dr. Sonali White, both of whom are involved in the medical field. Mr. Murali as a general practitioner in legal affairs. He's a, sorry, you are the main principal lawyer at Amicus, but he was also the general counsel for Cipla in the past, the pharmaceutical company, and Dr. Sonali Vaid is a healthcare consultant. And we are going to look at both the supply and the distribution of vaccination from its early stages to its late stages and how this entire process happens. So I will start by asking this question to our guest today. So how does the whole idea of vaccination, the process of vaccination itself start? Like, how do companies make these vaccines and how are these test candidates, essentially some of the vaccines that potentially can cure the COVID-19, after they are developed, how is the clinical trials and the permissions for it, which is like the early first stages of the vaccination process? How does this happen? I mean, India is supposed to be a vaccine capital for the world. We have been making vaccines forever now. But somehow we don't have vaccines. And it brings us to this question, is like, where have we gone wrong? So was it that we didn't have early vaccines which were part of the trials? What happened at the trials?
Thank you for having me. It's not that we didn't have vaccines. So if we go back to early 2020, there were several vaccine candidates, and there continue to be several vaccine candidates. So it is not that we didn't think of vaccines in 2020. But the way it begins is in the research and development stage. And there, several companies tried different platforms for different kinds of vaccines. Now, today we have, in the stage that has gone past the clinic, is approved, we have quite a few vaccines actually. So you've got AstraZeneca, the Covishield vaccine. You've got Covaxin, the Indian one by Bharat Biotech. You've got Sputnik, the Russian vaccine. You've got Sinopharm, the Chinese vaccine. You've got Pfizer. You've got Moderna. You've got J&J. So we've got now 7 vaccines, but it began with many more, and a few did not make it. A few are still in trial stage. So, for example, Merck and Sanofi, their vaccines haven't yet reached the market. We have a Biologic E, which is trying a vaccine candidate. We have Zydus, which has developed a vaccine candidate and is in trials. So there are many more that we could have. Now, of all of these, a full trial has been initiated only for Covaxin in India. All the other candidates really have done trials outside of India. So the issue of research development has been largely outside of India. It's only after these clinical trials that vaccines will come to market. there is a little bit of a wrinkle with Indian regulation, but we'll come to that later. And there are issues with the way trials are conducted in India, including with Covaxin. There are questions asked about the Covishield trial in India. So we'll come to detailing of that. But the news that everybody should be aware of is that we have vaccine candidates. Many have been approved, and therefore we can have them in India. The issue really that we need to talk about in little detail is why don't we have 2 billion doses?
Dr. Sonali, you want to walk us through what happened in the early clinical trials in India with Covaxin and other candidates?
So I think building upon what Murali said is that we have to think about two things. One is time. Could we have done things faster? Should we be seeing stockouts right now? And the other issue, I think, which we will go into later, is equity and whether our distribution channels are equitable. Because ultimately, I am optimistic that we will have enough availability of different vaccine candidates and the adequate numbers. But at present, we do not have those. And, my opinion is that, yes, we have a lot of vaccine candidates, which in itself is pretty remarkable globally and within India also. This is the fastest we have seen vaccine development happen historically. And just to build trust in the fact that it is possible to have vaccines developed fast and safely, is that a lot of the technology that is being used right now does have a history going back 20 years. And plus, this is the first time the whole world is sort of collaborating to solve the vaccine problem. So a lot of the regulations, the collaborations happen to be much faster than usual, where you only have a limited attention to solving a problem. So the question is, why did we not, in addition to developing new vaccine candidates within India, why did we not also look at licensing and permitting, Pfizer, Moderna more actively, those which already had trials done, just like we did with AstraZeneca? And I think if we had focused a little bit more, in addition to getting new platforms and technologies developed, if we had also expedited and focused on getting things where we already had at least phase 2 results sooner and more actively, then perhaps we could have, that could have been one of the things to look into. Yeah.
Okay, so we finally have like a lot of vaccine candidates, except I don't think we did a lot of trials. We did not give them permissions. But in terms of, again, production of these vaccines, India said we will produce 2 vaccine candidates at large, and third, if you include Sputnik, right? Oxford, AstraZeneca, Covishield, Covaxin, and Sputnik. Correct me if I'm wrong. But end of the day, all of these organizations received a series of orders. India acted as a manufacturing facility. There was a WHO program, if I'm not wrong, the COVAX program, which was funding money, which was giving money to Serum Institute to manufacture vaccines for the rest of the world. It wasn't as if we were making vaccines for India alone, but we were essentially preparing up to vaccinate about 4 or 5 billion people of the world, not just Indians. Now, what went wrong in this process? Was there any lack of communication from the Indian government, where these entities only receiving orders from outside, only support from the WHO? What kind of support was Indian government giving? And when you talk in terms of these vaccine candidates, there's also a lot of concern around IP, right? Like India has a lot of vaccination facilities, vaccine manufacturing facilities, but somehow it's only Serum Institute which is manufacturing the Oxford vaccine. Murli, can you help us understand what happened at this stage of manufacturing?
You have to actually go back to June, July, August of last year, which is when really some decisions had to be made. And one of the decisions that was taken was Serum would get funding from a whole lot of international bodies to manufacture the AstraZeneca vaccine. They had a similar deal with Novavax, another vaccine that is still in trial at the moment. So there was a bit of thinking at that time, perhaps, that if we get Novavax and we get AstraZeneca, and the Covaxin vaccine is successful in trials, we will have 3 candidates. So in that sense, we had candidates and they were looking promising. What we should have done then is to think, what will it take to manufacture 2 billion doses? And that's where today we're finding that even though there was a committee, it was a high power committee headed by a person from the Niti Aayog, who assured us that we would have enough vaccines when we needed it. The Prime Minister, in his Independence Day speech, assured that everybody would get vaccines. We now know that there was no plan to make 2 billion doses. And so that's where the problem starts. We didn't have capacity allocated for these COVID vaccines last year. And nothing was done to ramp up capacity if needed. Some infrastructure needed to be created in these facilities. Most of them are private players, but we also have public sector units that manufacture vaccines. So it doesn't seem like any conversation was had with any of these potential manufacturers to say, okay, we need 2 billion doses. How do we get these 2 billion doses by July? Now, if this discussion had happened then, when the vaccine candidates were passing clinical trials and had been approved, we would actually be able to get these out. What really happened was approval was granted, and a lot of us have views on how the trials were conducted, but approval was granted in January. Only 100 million doses were ordered by the government of India from Serum Institute. And so it seems like they didn't have the capacity to manufacture 1 billion doses at that time. We need 2 billion. We don't even, in January, have a view of whether or not we would have had even 1 billion doses. So that's where we seem to have faltered. Between August last year and January this year, it seems like everybody just took it easy and said, COVID will go away. The Prime Minister, of course, announced that we had conquered COVID without vaccines. And so in January, the crisis actually began. When the second wave hit us in March, questions were asked. And that's when we understood that we don't have the capacity allocated ready to make 2 billion vaccines. So a little bit of money was spent on the clinical trials. There was government support for Serum for a clinical trial. There was government support for Bharat Biotech's clinical trial. There was government support for Bharat Biotech to start the vaccine production. So some of the work in the research part was done by the National Institute of Virology. So there was some government support, but no clear indication from the government to these manufacturers and no plan to actually make 2 billion vaccines. So what should have happened is for someone in the government, whoever the task force is, to sit down with all these manufacturers and say, how do we get 2 billion doses? So you will have questions like, we don't have these consumables, we don't have these raw materials, we don't have other, fill and finish facilities, classic supply chain issues. So if this discussion was had in August last year or January this year or even March this year, then perhaps we would have had a better view of how to get to 2 billion doses. At the moment, the way government is telling us, it seems like every vaccine candidate will have to get approved. So those that are still in clinical trials will have to get approved. Some which hadn't even started clinical trials will have to get approved. and they'll have to get manufactured and ready with full capacity utilization before the end of the year for us to get 2 billion doses. Now, that's almost impossible to achieve.
So, Sonali, I want you to ask this question, right? Like, while all of this was going on in India, what was essentially WHO doing, right? Like, from a global health perspective, from the whole COVAX perspective itself, it's WHO which has been monitoring all of this. In fact, some of the money was also, and support was also coming from them. Don't we have any kind of observers from the WHO which actually looks into all of this? Was there support that India did not utilize? In fact, there are news reports that saying that India rejected WHO support when the second wave hit us.
So I'll take the first thing, that what was WHO doing. So they did two things. One was COVAX and one was the CTAP, which is the COVID Common Technology Access Pool. So the idea, which did not go too far. So basically with COVAX, the idea was, that governments and manufacturers would commit to having more global equity in terms of vaccine access, which is critically important. In many countries, health workers have not even gotten their first shot of the vaccine. So in principle, global equity is critical. However, relying so heavily on one manufacturer seems to have been a huge oversight. Relying for several tens of countries for Serum Institute to deliver, along with having to deliver for India, seems to have been a huge oversight. The issue is also with we keep talking about patent waivers, and that'll probably take some more time, even though the US is now backing TRIPS waivers. But just waiving a patent is not enough, because once a pharma company gets its patent waived, whoever wants to manufacture that product will have to reverse engineer the whole technology, which will spend, which maybe they're able to do, maybe not. And most likely they'll manage it, but it'll, again, use up a lot of time. So to meet that purpose, WHO came up with this idea of having a common technology transfer, to which companies have not signed up. And there was probably not enough thought given to how this would become operational, through what pressures or means they would actually get companies to commit to technology transfer. Because it's interesting, initially, if you look at the story of how the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine happened, initially there was a commitment to, not aiming for any profit. And then Oxford AstraZeneca ended up, the partnership ended up happening with AstraZeneca. And, and then it did not go the way that it was envisioned, in terms of being totally open access and, free for people to use. Even though Oxford AstraZeneca did, scale up manufacturing, link up not only with Serum Institute, but with several manufacturers around the globe to manufacture the vaccine. Early on, they had planned to scale up to large quantities globally, which, of course, Pfizer, Moderna have not done even that much. So I think the miscalculation was in relying on one manufacturing company to meet the giant share of the global need for the vaccine in low and middle income countries.
Okay, so the issue at large was that we were too dependent on one or two companies to manufacture all the vaccines for the globe. I want to just go back, say last year of August, when we were actually discussing about vaccines and how India needs to essentially design a strategy for vaccination. I believe this is the time, August 15th, after just the Prime Minister's speech, is when that you have the vaccine, the empowered group for vaccination, which decides that it's going to design a vaccine supply strategy, right? at this stage, I believe there was a lot of lobbying from the private sector to essentially bring in a public-private partnership so that you allow private participation in vaccination process, and they largely succeeded in it. Now, the question I have is that while one sector of the private consortiums were able to lobby for what they need from the government to essentially relax, liberalize the whole vaccination process, but at the same time, the manufacturers were facing hard time navigating through the government. I don't think it was, if one has to look at it from a very Indian government lens, or one has to look at it from a very global point of view, what was essentially happening. I mean, behind the scenes in terms of IP, you had organizations like Melinda Gates Foundation, which was trying to stop the vaccine, the COVID shield vaccine, to be in public domain so that anyone else can manufacture it. So how do you see this phenomenon of few companies being able to lobby, get what they want, but everyone else failing at certain things?
It's not unusual. We expect that there will be a lot of lobbying, especially on IP issues. But I think the Indian government had leverage. And the leverage it had was that the world could not be vaccinated without Indian manufacturing facilities. So we had manufacturing leverage. And what we could have done then is to say, okay, this is great that you've got licenses to Serum Institute. Can we also get licenses for other facilities to manufacture? So that wouldn't have been a very difficult thing to negotiate. Now, if there was a lack of willingness to license the vaccine to several manufacturers, it wouldn't have been very difficult to get Serum to subcontract some parts of the manufacture, if not the whole of it, to other facilities that could do parts of the manufacturing process. So if the bottleneck was fill and finish, we have plenty of fill and finish capacity in India. If it was any other part of the manufacturing process, we could have done that. If raw materials were an issue, in August, we could have figured out, here is a problem. We're going to have shortage of, let's say, bioreactor bags, which is a consumable. If we have raw material issues, we could have had that sorted last year to say, how much of this can be indigenously procured? How much do we need to order overseas to be able to get to 2 billion doses? I'm not even talking about vaccinating the rest of the world, just for India. So these are discussions which could have been had. If there were IP hurdles in that, then it couldn't have been very difficult for the Indian government to have a conversation with the Indian players and say, okay, you think you can make it, but there is an IP issue. Why don't you go ahead and do the R&D and be ready for production? So in January or February, when the vaccine candidates are ready for commercial production, we can quite easily deal with the IP issues. We can issue licenses, we can do a compulsory licensing, we can do contract manufacturing. So there are many different ways of cracking the IP issue. Now, sadly, because we didn't do the exercise last year, we find ourselves in a situation where we're now trying to figure out what the IP landscape is. What the IP landscape is for the vaccine, for the platform, for the consumables, for the raw materials, for even some of the equipment that is needed to make all of these. So this exercise could have been done last year. If it had been done last year, then in January this year, we would have known these are the IP issues we're going to have if we have to produce. In October last year, when India made a proposal for the IP waiver, it should have had a good idea as to what it will entail. Unfortunately, we don't have those details. So if someone did ask, what are these patents that you want to license? What are these patents you want waived? We don't really have a good list. So this exercise, had we done it last year, we would have had a good idea this year. And when we had the ask at the WTO for an IP waiver, we would have been credible in saying, here is a list, and here is why we need an IP waiver, because it's too long. We have 2,000 of these patents in different parts of the world, and therefore it is not practical to sit down and work out patent by patent licenses in each of those countries. and therefore we'd like an IP waiver. This would have been very, very credible had we done a little bit of the homework. Today, we find ourselves in a situation where we don't have a list. The rest of the world is telling us, listen, you're asking for something, you don't know exactly what it is. And in India, we're saying to the Indian audience, to the Supreme Court, and yesterday in the press release that PIB put out, that just waiving patents or granting licenses will not result in vaccines because there is something beyond patents that we need. So a compulsory license will not get you vaccines. So this is in conflict with what we are telling the world at the at the WTO, asking for a IP waiver. What we're telling our own people, what we're telling the Supreme Court of India, and what the very committee that's supposed to be producing vaccines, the head of that committee is saying, well, compulsory licenses and patents are not really relevant in this. So there is a real difficulty in trying to understand what the government's position is. Is IP a barrier or not? It's telling the WTO it is. It's telling the Supreme Court it is not. When we talk about production and supplies, we're not able to clearly set out what the bottlenecks are and how IP is a barrier to increasing production. So there's a lot of issues with the way the government's handled it and the way the government's communicated it. Last year, it said, don't worry about it, we have enough vaccines. In January, it said, oh, we don't need vaccines. In March, it is saying, don't worry, by December 2021, you will have vaccines. But there's no detailing and they haven't answered any of these questions.
Okay, so I want to go from there to Sonali on whatever vaccines we had, few million vaccines. We started vaccinating the vulnerable groups above 45 years of age. So how does vaccination itself happen? Like India has been doing vaccinations, but they were not adult vaccinations. We are essentially doing vaccinations for children, right? Like when they're born. So the pulse polio vaccine program is essentially cited as an ideal kind of vaccination program. But how does this universal vaccination, even universal child vaccination, actually happen when you look at from a healthcare perspective? Who are involved in this entire supply chain? What kind of decisions are made, and how does this vaccination side from healthcare happen actually? Are PHCs involved? Are private hospitals involved? What has changed right now with COVID as a healthcare practitioner, Sonali? What do you think about all of this mess?
So I think India has done quite well with the regular immunization, not during COVID, which is a different situation, but the regular routine immunization system has been modernized. There's been a program with Gavi and UNDP, which has been running for, I think, about 6 to 7 years. I think it's called EVEN. And, so it's quite streamlined. They have, they track the stocks from the factories to the PHC. They even have like temperature loggers. Earlier, there used to be an issue with maintaining the cold chain and recording whether it's being maintained, because you had to take out the logger from the cold box or from the fridge, and then it would show a higher temperature reading. So there were all these issues. So, now that has been solved, so it has been significantly improved and modernized. So we do have the capacity to maintain cold chain, to distribute vaccines at a very large scale, including up to from the factories. It goes to 4 regional centers across the country, and from there it is distributed out to CHCs and PHCs and hospitals. So, of course, nothing's perfect, but it is a reasonably good program for a large country like ours. And when we think about it, what does a vaccine program actually need? You need the availability of a vaccine, you need the supply chain, and you need somebody at the end of it to deliver it, and you need people to be willing to take it. In that aspect, I don't see much of an issue if it is an adult or a children's vaccine. The only thing we can think about is probably numbers, because if you're looking at routine immunization, you have a certain number of births every year. You don't have to vaccinate a very big swath of a population at the same time. So what we are looking here is probably larger numbers, even at a local level. But again, we do have the systems for that. And right now, even if we look at the current system of distribution and vaccine availability, you have ASHAs going and sitting in the remotest of areas with their ice boxes. And you have so many centers in the bigger cities within within a 5-kilometer radius, that even not even 5, within a 3-kilometer radius of my home in Delhi, there are like 6 places which were offering the vaccine if there wasn't a stock out. So I think in terms of distribution, and the ability to reach out to people, we have the systems. What is missing is the outreach aspect. So earlier, I feel in the vaccine programs, it was more about going to the community. And now it is more like, people are, the way it's designed is you've opened a shop with a new product, and you just expect people to walk in and buy it and know about it and know that it is good to take. So that outreach element, with some exceptions, some local governments, some districts, they've done a good job. But overall, I feel that element is missing. And, in previous campaigns, if you look at the polio campaign, what image comes to mind? The image that comes to mind is of a health worker which is crossing a flooded river to reach somebody in a remote area. That's the image that comes to mind if you look at photographs of the polio vaccination. And now what is the image that comes to my mind when I look at, when I think about vaccination for COVID? It will be somebody like me, a privileged person in an urban setup, sitting at a corporate hospital and getting my photograph clicked, taking the vaccine. So that outreach aspect is missing. So I do not think it is so much of a issue of not having the systems to reach the vaccine to remote areas or within districts. It is more, I feel, of an issue of outreach and uptake, and maybe Murali can add to this.
Okay, so let's come to the existing crisis. We don't have vaccines. The supply side of this vaccines is a bit messy with the way the current systems are being pushed. So, and when you look at procurement of vaccines, the center, when it liberalized the vaccine procurement, has essentially said the private sector can procure some 25% of the vaccines, state can procure their own vaccinations. But at the same time, you have essentially decentralized procurement, and states are really unable to do it. Like, you have chief ministers like Arvind Kejriwal coming out and saying we are unable to talk to international pharma companies. They're not negotiating with us. They won't even listen to us. Then you had all the global tenders failing. Multiple states have issued it. Punjab, if I'm not wrong, Telangana has done it as well, AP and UP. And when you look at the supply side of it, it's been centralized at some level with COVID. States have no choice on whom to vaccinate, how to vaccinate, except for people to come to the vaccination centers on their own. Is there a vaccine strategy in place at all now? At least even now, are they thinking about it? I see some states moving away from COVID, doing their own vaccine strategy, like Maharashtra is trying to do that. Tamil Nadu is doing that. Telangana has said they won't vaccinate 18 plus population. In fact, they are trying to identify who would be classified, who can be classified as a super spreader, and classify them. At some level, the states are on their own, and each state is coming up with its own experimentation. What do you think of this whole mess right now? Is there a strategy that can be advised to states? Can the center play that role, or can WHO play that role?
Well, we don't have a strategy. Let's start from there. We had a strategy, and the strategy was in the vaccine policy. We've had an outstanding vaccine policy. The official version of it, the last version of it, is 2011. And the basis of that was very simple. It was universal free immunization, which means that everybody got a vaccine and got it free. So that was simple. The WHO loved it, took it to the rest of the developing world and said, India's model is the model for the rest of the world. And that was fine in January. In January, we said we will prioritize with the supply we have. The prioritization will be based on good medical and scientific advice, and we will go about it well. Now, we had the stocks, we had the prioritization. So between January and March, we were actually doing quite well. In March, we saw all these op-eds coming out in the newspapers that we should have liberalization, and this is license Raj, and if we don't liberalize, we will not get more vaccines. And so suddenly you had these great celebrities coming out to say we should liberalize. So 19th of April, we saw the new liberalized vaccine strategy. And if you think that's the strategy we are actually implementing, you're wrong. Because that document, which is just about a month old, is not being implemented. What we're implementing today is perhaps version 4, 5, or 6 of it, depending on how you think of as a version. The strategy on 19th of April said central government will buy 50% and everybody else can get 50%, which means the states didn't have an allocation. The states, private bodies, resident welfare associations, corporations, private entities, hospitals could all go and speak to manufacturers and get allocations from the 50%. There would be a price for the central government, which was 150 rupees, and there would not be a price for the other 50%. That was what the 19th April announcement said. Then, soon thereafter, there was an announcement that, no, we will fix price for state government for the 50%. But we will not fix price for private players and hospitals. Then there was criticism to say that if you fix price for states and not for the private hospitals, the states will get nothing because the hospitals will be willing to pay more and all the vaccines will go to the hospitals. So states will get nothing from their 50%. Then there was a second change to say, okay, we will fix a price for the states, but we will also give you 50% of that remaining 50%. So 25% of the total will come to the states. But this is not in the press releases. This you have to figure out from the various affidavits the Union of India has filed. So we are trying to figure out a strategy and the policy from different press releases, tweets, and affidavits that the government has been filing. So now you have a situation where there is a price for the central government, it gets 50%. There is a price for the state government, it now gets 25%. Whether there is a price or not for the private players, we don't know, but they're entitled to 25%. It gets even more complicated because the private players getting the 25% may vary state by state. So the private players may not take up the same 25% that, say, Bihar takes up and leaves out its 25%, because private players think we don't have that many private hospitals in Bihar, and therefore we don't take up that. But they may have a lot of private hospitals in Karnataka, and therefore what they purchase and sell in Karnataka will be more than 25%. So that's your first problem, that you've created multiple markets with effectively a monopoly seller of a scarce product where price is now going to be market driven. So that's your first problem. And that means that there will be no equitable allocation. Then we come to the issue of, okay, you've done this. How do you actually allocate? Which means that the central government can't vaccinate by itself. So it has to give to the states. So from its 50%, which it has procured, how will it allocate to each state? That is exceptionally unclear. We don't know on what basis the central government is handing out those vaccines to the states. I have tried to figure out whether it is by number of cases, whether it's by the population above 45, and none of those criteria seem to fit what the central government is doing. So that's your first problem. For the second part of it, which is the 25% that the states can get directly from the manufacturers. The original policy said they can have a discussion with the manufacturers, negotiate, and get it. Now we are told by the central government in the courts that, well, that's not exactly true. What we've done is decided how much the manufacturer should give to each of the states in that 25%. So now there is another allocation being done, not by the manufacturer, but by the central government. And that allocation is now earmarked. So we've now created a quota. The 50% that the central government gives the states will be for the plus 45, those who are over 45 years old. And what the states are entitled to get from the manufacturers directly are now directed by the central government and will be given on the basis of relative population 18 to 45 years in each state. And the private players can go off and vaccinate whoever they like. Above 18, there is no limitation on them. So if you see the policy now, it's gone through so many changes that the states are finding it difficult to plan. They don't know how many vaccines they will get, when they will get it, and how to go about and vaccinate. If we had continued with the policy in January that we had in January, the states could determine how to distribute these vaccines. And that is how it should have been done. The states will decide based on good science, good medical advice, where to allocate these scarce vaccines. Should it be done by age? Should it be done by district? Should it be done at ward level? The states would have been in a great place to decide that. What has happened, unfortunately, is the central government's deciding everything and expecting the states to then deliver. And this is the main reason why, even though there may be some vaccines available, they're not being distributed in the ideal way. So to make the supply situation worse, we've got very poor distribution and allocation strategy.
So it looks like we try to create mini markets for two vaccine manufacturers within India to get more clients for them within India. I don't know what to make of that. But Sonali, I want to ask you this from a very epidemiology perspective, from a very healthcare perspective. States essentially need data to look into these. States essentially need to strategize how to vaccinate their population, how to handle this wave of the epidemic, and also to ensure that there is no third wave. What do you see can be done about this? I mean, we know that it's a messy situation. Can we move away from some of this? Can some of this be standardized by states? I mean, we see some states trying to do something. At least with Chhattisgarh, I've seen that they've been putting out data saying we are allocating vaccines district-wise for different classes of people, for people below poverty line and people above poverty line. And they're trying to move away from whatever the center's been pushing. But what do you think can be done at this stage, at least from a very healthcare perspective?
So it's really, so because of this opening up for 18 plus from the center, and in a situation of scarcity, it was really bad move. To my knowledge, none of the public health experts that I look up to, nobody was in favor of opening up like this for 18 plus. Now what that creates is a general expectation among the public that across the country, whether the state's making the decision or the center's making the decision. Now if a state decides that, okay, we will not open up for 80% because we don't 18 plus because we don't have the vaccines, the public will not be happy. So the states are in a difficult situation. The Chhattisgarh situation that you describe, I think the latest was that there was, I think the High Court, there was objection to the fact that Chhattisgarh was prioritizing weaker sections of the society, and now they have to reserve 1/3 for the Antodaya, the 1/3 for another another more vulnerable section, and 1/3 for above BPL, so above poverty line. So there will be these dynamics that will play out in the states because of what the center has now put, that expectation that has been made. I have, we all have friends and families in other states where vaccination is not available for 18 plus, and there's a lot of discontent around that. And what is actually happening is, in some of these states, the private hospitals still continue to offer vaccinations for 18 to 44, where the government is not doing that. So it's creating added layers of inequity in the whole system. So it is a difficult situation for states to be in now, where they don't have the vaccines, where this expectation has been created in the general public that it should be available for 18 plus. So, yeah. And I'd just like to add, in terms of places like Chhattisgarh and other places where you have, more rural populations, tribal communities. So if you look at Canada and some other countries, they actually prioritized vaccinating the Native American communities. So which we don't see happening here. And it's really, really scary to envision that, it is possible that some of the smaller communities where COVID has reached, they may possibly be facing extinction. So we really need to focus our efforts in that direction. And I don't know if there's any going back on the whole private sector involvement. And this is part of the larger thrust where the Indian governance is leaning towards. I view this whole involvement of paying for a vaccine where you could get it free as sort of giving people a flavor of accessing private healthcare. People who would not, in a situation of scarcity, it's not a choice. We cannot say that, it's available in the private sector, it's available in the government sector, go whatever you prefer. There is no choice because there isn't availability. It's fastest fingers first. If on COVID, I managed to get a slot somewhere and I don't want to pay 700, 800,000, but I will still end up going and paying for it because I would rather get the vaccine and not worry about those 1,000 rupees. And plus there's issue of distance also. So you might not get a slot in your location. So you might get it somewhere far off. And for many people, that's an additional cost. So using choice, the idea of choice to justify that, okay, it's available for free and paid, it does not hold any water, in my opinion.
Okay, I had some few questions here, but some of them are related to COVID, which is essentially what benefit does COVID bring at all? Can you have some thoughts on it, please? Another question from people is, how many of the Indian vaccines are recognized globally for global travel, maybe? Then there's one question from Murli in particular. What is the current status of internal manufacturing capacity? What's the possibility of augmenting this with improving production within India and also bringing some of them from outside?
Srinivas, I'll let you answer the COVID question, but I'll take the other two. One is that we have a lot of internal manufacturing capacity. As I said earlier, we have the ability to produce 2 billion vaccines. And therefore, if we organized ourselves slightly better and used the capacity that we have, we could have had the 2 billion vaccines by now. So the problem is not that we don't have internal manufacturing capacity in India. We actually have plenty. And we are privileged compared to a lot of other countries that we have this capacity. Historically, the vast majority of vaccines around the world have been made in India. So that's not really the issue. It is using the manufacturing capacity to make vaccines for COVID. So that problem we haven't resolved. There isn't a glut of vaccines in the rest of the world. So that is the reason why all these tenders that have been put out have been unsuccessful. Each of these entities that is putting out a tender, including municipal corporations, are effectively competing against Indian states, other municipal corporations, Indian private entities, like the corporate entities, and all countries around the world. So you're in a marketplace of about 100, 150 to get the same 4 vaccines or 6 vaccines that are there around the world. And if you don't have vaccines in India, it's unlikely that there is a warehouse somewhere in the world where there are 1 billion doses waiting to be sold to whoever lands up with, I don't know how many buckets of cash, but and to just take delivery and have it. So overseas capacity does not exist for 2021 as far as India is concerned. There are no vaccines of any substantial quantity available for this year. The reason for that is all the other countries, developed countries around the world, pre-ordered it, got their doses, and all the batches that are going to be produced this year have already been spoken for. So there is no chance, I think, that we will get any substantial quantities of vaccines from outside of India waiting to be imported into India this year. Why do we not have our vaccines approved overseas? Because trials haven't been completed. It's as simple as that. The WHO will approve, as it has approved several other vaccines. The US FDA will approve. The UK MHRA will approve. Same with the EU. All of these entities will approve. If we finish clinical trials, the trials are credible, the facility is manufacturing it in a way that conforms to GMP, then we can get them approved. At the moment, we don't have one yet. The one Indian vaccine that many of you may have taken is Covaxin, and that is still in clinical trial mode. We haven't seen the clinical trial data. So until we see the data, until those facilities are inspected and found to be in conformity with good manufacturing practice, you won't get anyone to approve it. So those are the 2 questions, and these are my 2 answers.
I have one important question. India was supposed to be a model, right? Like how India vaccinated its population is supposed to be set as a standard for the rest of the world. And India was going to export vaccines. India was like at least supposed to be. India was supposed to export vaccines. India was supposed to export its strategy. We're supposed to do a lot of things, but everything failed. Now the question is, are we even looking at a scenario of universal vaccination even within India? Is that even possible, likely in the near future? Now, what are the implications of what's happening in India for the rest of the world, to Africa, to other Latin American countries, to everyone else who relies on India's vaccine manufacturing capacity?
So the big challenge, I think, is going to be that we're not going to be able to vaccinate our own this year, despite what the Minister Prakash Javadekar seems to think. And he's Minister for Heavy Industries, isn't it? He seems to think that we will get vaccination done for India in December. But he hasn't given us how the capacity and production and supply is going to look month on month to reach 2 billion doses. So I am not convinced, based on what has been put out by the government and the manufacturers themselves, that we will have 2 billion vaccines this year. If that is the situation, then it's unlikely that any other country that is relying on India for vaccines will get anything. So there is a real risk to the rest of the world that if India doesn't fix the vaccine crisis here, they will be part of the crisis. So there is real issue there. On the equity of it, if there is a market which continues to be the way it is now, which is free and paid, I fear that a lot of the population in India will just not have access to a vaccine. It's also not helped by the fact that the government promotes quackery. So even where it is available, so there are parts of rural India, and if you go on to the CoWIN site, you can go district by district. And I did the exercise for a few districts. There are vaccines available, but people aren't taking them. The main reason for it is that the government promoted quackery. It said throughout that COVID's gone, nothing to worry about. Then it said, you take Coronil, you take Ayush, you won't get it. It promoted others who were advocating this kind of quackery about COVID. So you have a situation where there are vaccines available free in some parts of India, even now, but there are not enough people to go and take it because of all that we have done with this promotion of quackery for the last 1 year. I fear that even giving it free, making it available in areas which are vulnerable, is just not enough to get over all of the quackery that we've promoted for the last 1 year. So there is a lot of communication that we need to fix to be able to get the population vaccinated, even when vaccines are available.
Sonali,
So I'd
same
like to add
question.
to that.
Yeah,
I'd
same
like to
question.
add to that. It's even, sorry, Srinivas, go ahead.
Sorry, I want to add an extra question for you in particular. What do you think needs to be done so that we are out of this mess? Do we need more healthcare experts in this? Do we need more epidemiologists? What do we need to do? Like, end of the day, government doesn't seem to be listening to any experts, whether healthcare or not. Yeah.
So to add to what was said about, the issue of what is being termed hesitancy, but I'm not a big fan of that word because I think it is deliberately created. And I think a lot of people who, even in rural areas, some people who took the first dose are somehow not interested in taking the second dose. And I think there's a lot more harm that has been done in the last 1 year. So the same ASHA worker who was told to put posters on your house during the first wave, if somebody was sick, which caused a lot of stigma, now we expect the same ASHA worker to build trust with the community and engage them in vaccination. And on top of that, where is the trust towards the health system in rural areas? They get a broken PHC where things go wrong. They don't want to go to hospitals, local hospitals, because they feel they don't get good care. There are all sorts of incidents of people, not receiving good care or passing away when they go to the hospital. So the trust is our currency in a pandemic, and there is no trust. And whatever, as it is such a difficult task to build trust towards health interventions. And here we are just frittering away trust, all this talk of, coronel and other medications, all this talk of Indians are somehow naturally immune. There's something exceptional about our country or our environment that we will not get as affected. Or there is something special about rural areas that they will not get affected, that people living in rural areas have higher immunity. So all of these notions, a prolonged fractured health system in the periphery and even in urban areas, which has, really led to difficulties. Even with childhood immunization, there are issues of, vaccine uptake because of lack of, community involvement. So, so we really have an uphill task. And unless, center, state, governments all sort of work together with a united vision, which is a pipe dream at this stage, towards, the committee that's been formed for the third wave does not have a single woman on it, does not have, has only one public health epidemiologist. The person who's chairing the committee is from the private sector. So, all of these show where the general trend is and what we can expect moving forward. So it's really hard for me to dredge up a sense of optimism and think about what we can do. I think the states can do work in terms of, better communication. I see state governments also sharing incorrect information on their social media handles, right? You can verify information before you share it. All of this matters. It's not very difficult to have preparedness and prevention in peripheries because populations are more scattered. They're not as dense as the cities. So at a local level, if the administration works well, a lot can be done. Some states have managed to do that in pockets. But at a larger level, unless the center starts really focusing on saving lives and prevention, uh, you know, uh, it's going to be really difficult, because if you know we are not going to be able to vaccinate, so we really need to work on other prevention aspects, and also simultaneously work on preparedness also. So we need to contact tracing has been absolutely absent. We've used technology not as a facilitator, we've used it as a barrier. So COVID is not only the process of getting vaccinated in India, it's not only a technology barrier, because everybody now has to register on the app 18 to 44, and but you also need an ID document. So it's both a documentation barrier, it's also a technology barrier, and there are also gender aspects here, because uptake of mobile phones is much lower in women. It's probably around 35 to 40%. And this does not mean smartphones. This includes all types of phones. And there's a big gap between having a phone, being able to open a website, being able to type in it and sign up. And it's really difficult for people to help each other, even for NGOs to help people sign up, because you have to maintain distance. You can't be looking into each other's phones at close contact and helping each other sign up. And how this is displayed prominently is, X crore of registrations done on COVID. A registration does not mean appointment. An appointment does not mean getting a vaccination. Having we don't have enough vaccine. Secondly, having a vaccine in a vial is not going to be of any use till it is injected, till somebody gets administered. So, I think unless there is a serious rethink of what is the central government aspiring towards, I'm not sure that, things will change much soon enough. Ultimately, next year, next 2 years, something will happen, pandemics end, but at what cost?
I have one last question for you, Sonali, again. I mean, in terms of what we are seeing in terms of hesitancy and the whole IMA's battle with Ramdev, right? Clearly, this government does not want to listen to the health experts, the doctors or the pharma experts, no one. Whom are they even listening to? I mean, who is advising this government? And do you want to say anything about the challenges that doctors are facing because of this exercise that the government's doing?
So I can talk about the common doctor on the street, right? I have a lot of friends and others who are in clinics right now, and it's really, really difficult. Even basic things like government guidelines, they still contain things like ivermectin. And so doctors who are practicing evidence-based medicine are questioned. Why did you not give me the corona medicine? And those that are prescribing correctly sometimes lose patients. Same situation with, thankfully, plasma has been withdrawn from the guidelines, but too little, too late. This whole wave, so many people who could have spent more time with their loved ones who were sick were instead running around to arrange for plasma and other medications which were not useful. So it really makes the task of the frontline physician very, very hard in an already, a situation that is extremely traumatic already, to further have to deal with these complications that are created by incorrect guidelines and other instructions. And there's a recent order by the Delhi government which stops us from talking about Mucor without permission from the government. So I am not sure what are the dynamics that are going on that are leading to such actions from the center and from certain state governments. But they are not helping anyone. We, instead of focusing on helping the public, on helping patients, a lot of us have to spend our energy in trying to address certain things that should have been intuitively, automatically taken care of by the government. Why are we having to have NGOs and others deliver oxygen cylinders to districts? Why was it not done already? So we had enough warning. Even if we were sleeping in January and February, when the wave began in Maharashtra, the rest of the country should have been alerted to prepare, but it did not happen. We really need to refocus. And I think what leadership does will not happen on its own. We need to insist at whatever level we are on to push in the right direction. So the withdrawing of plasma did not happen on its own. Governments will need to show that we are doing something. So they will try to leave in. Ivermectin is still in a lot of state guidelines. Azithromycin, all these medications are still there. And I'm moving a little bit from the topic, but governments need to be sort of pressurized to buy scientists, by public health doctors, by the larger community, by the public, to shift their stance. And even if it is something that we have to keep chipping away at slowly, one conversation, one letter, one policy brief at a time. I think all of us need to keep doing that, because I do not expect anything to happen automatically now.
Murli, I have a last question for you as well. It's very clear that a lot of this is actually being driven at some level at the courts, where because someone is approaching the courts, then the government says, oh no, we will do this or we will do that. We are doing something. And when we look at the whole oxygen crisis that happened, similar before the whole vaccine crisis, is that the Parliamentary Committee on Health actually predicted that we do not have the oxygen manufacturing capacity and we may be looking at shortages, we need to improve it. Right now, the parliament's not in session, they're not being allowed, like the parliamentary committees are not being allowed to sit. Do you think that discussion should move away a bit from courts to the parliament, to the public? Where should this even happen? Like, it's very clear that the government's not doing anything.
I'm not really hopeful. Even if Parliament was in session, the government enjoys a brute majority. It just shuts down a discussion, and discussion in Parliament has become very, very removed, far removed from the people. In a time of crisis like this, what anyone says in Parliament is not going to reach people on the streets, people who've lost jobs, people who've lost loved ones, are not going to be impacted by what is said in Parliament. If Parliament was functioning in the way it was meant to function, the government may have been embarrassed in Parliament and maybe change its view or reform itself. But that is very unlikely with this government and this Parliament. It's not like you have in the UK, for example, where the Prime Minister is embarrassed by what has been said, or a policy changes because Parliament feels strongly about it. So I don't see how Parliament is going to help during this crisis. That is the reason people are going to court. Unfortunately, courts are not being helped by lawyers. Lawyers are not being helped by experts. So if a judge has to decide which hospital will get how much oxygen, or what is a fair way of distributing certain drugs, then we are in deep trouble. And we're seeing mistakes being made. There was a statement by a judge in the Gujarat High Court who said, why can't we have remdesivir distributed like paracetamol? We'll have some other judge making some other similar comment. We have one other who said, where is the research to say that smokers are more likely to get COVID than non-smokers? So in many cases, while the judges are trying to grapple with this, they are not experts. They're not being helped by lawyers who have any expertise in this. And then sometimes you get caught into these rabbit holes where the secretary is now preparing a report as to why smoking causes or doesn't cause COVID, or why remdesivir can't be distributed like paracetamol. So we're chasing people around some of these exercises which are completely futile. The examples are so many that courts are overwhelmed. Each high court is dealing with this slightly differently. The counsel before the high courts are all trying to learn what this is all about as they go about. The government counsel are trying to find uh, officers in government to give answers to the questions that are being posed in court. So the level of chaos and running around is exceptionally high. We've had very little to show for it other than to say that we will have centrally supplied oxygen, and that seems to be the top priority today. But we haven't dealt with any of these issues. So the questions that the Supreme Court asked in the suo motu matter are still unanswered, despite two affidavits from the Union government on 26th of April and 9th of May. Nothing really has come of it. And the high courts aren't really issuing any orders. They keep asking, why don't you have vaccines? How many vaccines have you ordered? Why don't you do something? So there's a lot of this conversation happening, but I don't really see very much progress being made. It's all well meaning. I think people are trying very hard, but the court is not the place to do it. Parliament is not the place. Unfortunately, this parliament is not the place to do it. So I'm not very hopeful of that. One can only hope that some miracle happens and the government starts listening to experts, as Sonali said as well, that then we have some hope. All the experts are doing is writing op-eds, going on TV and saying, please listen to us. And the government just isn't. So I don't see a solution either in parliament or in courts.
Thank you, both of you. It was a very lovely discussion. And I think we were right on time, probably extended by 10 minutes. But I hope things get better. That's all I can say for at this stage. And you do take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.